For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs dominated the land. They were not just rulers of their time. They were architects of entire ecosystems, shaping forests, plains, and river valleys with their immense size and diverse forms. From towering sauropods that could strip entire trees in minutes, to agile predators whose shadows terrified entire landscapes, their presence defined an age. And for a long while, it seemed they would endure forever. But 66 million years ago, that illusion shattered in an instant. A mountain-sized asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of billions of atomic bombs. The skies lit with firestorms, oceans rose in colossal waves, and shockwaves circled the planet. Within days, Earth had become unrecognizable. Its forests turned to ash, its seas poisoned with debris, and its atmosphere darkened by dust. In the weeks that followed, sunlight all but vanished. For years the planet lived under a twilight sky, and in that unnatural night, 75% of all species were wiped away. This was the end of the age of dinosaurs, or so the stories usually told. In truth, the extinction was less an abrupt full stop, and more a prolonged, uneven unraveling. Some creatures endured for months, even centuries, before succumbing. Others seized the chaos as opportunity, laying the foundations for the world we know today. This early Paleocene epoch, called the Dainian, is a forgotten chapter, a time when life's survivors stitched together the first ecosystems of the modern age. And that is the story we'll explore. If you find yourself fascinated by lost worlds, hidden histories, and the resilience of life, consider subscribing, because the past still holds countless mysteries waiting to be uncovered. 66 million years ago, in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, the sky tore open. A colossal asteroid, estimated at more than 10 kilometers across, struck the Earth at more than 20 kilometers per second. In less than a heartbeat, it released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear detonations. What followed was not simply an impact. It was the single most transformative natural disaster in the history of life on land. The ground convulsed as shockwaves raced outward. Within minutes, forests for hundreds of kilometers were leveled, coastlines shattered, and seas pushed upward in tsunamis taller than city towers. Around the globe, earthquakes were triggered, landslides cascaded into rivers, and volcanic fields erupted under stress. The planet groaned as if struck in its very core. But the most enduring effects came not from the immediate violence, but from what the atmosphere carried away. Trillions of tons of vaporized rock, dust, and soot surged upward into the stratosphere. Sulfates from shattered limestone mixed with carbon dioxide and wildfire smoke, forming a choking veil around the planet. Sunlight dimmed, then vanished. Within days, Earth was cloaked in a permanent twilight. This was the beginning of the impact winter. Photosynthesis collapsed almost overnight. Plants withered, and food webs fell with them. Herbivorous dinosaurs, already devastated by fire and shock, starved in the dim world. Predators soon followed, their massive bodies unable to sustain themselves without prey. The great dynasty of non-avian dinosaurs, once numbering in thousands of species across every continent, dwindled to silence. Yet even as giants perished, smaller lives endured. Fungi thrived in the darkness, feeding on a world of decay. In sediments dating from these years, paleontologists find a striking signal: an overwhelming abundance of fungal spores. This fungal spike marks a planet transformed into a graveyard, but also into fertile ground for survivors. In the charred clearings where forests once stood, ferns were among the first green to return. Their light spores spread easily through the stagnant winds, germinating quickly in nutrient-poor soils. This fern spike, another marker in the fossil record, signaled the earliest steps of recovery. Still, for several years, Earth was more gray than green, more barren than blooming. Animals that survived did so not by strength or size, but by strategy. Creatures with low metabolic needs, turtles, crocodiles, small mammals, and certain birds, endured in burrows, caves, or water bodies, buffered from the worst of the climate crash. Insects that fed on detritus, such as beetles and termites, thrived on the endless stores of decaying biomass. Life did not vanish, it adapted in miniature, retreating into niches where little energy was required. For humans looking back, it is easy to imagine the extinction as instantaneous. One day dinosaurs, the next day mammals. But the fossil record tells a subtler story. Local dinosaur populations may have lingered for months, perhaps years, in isolated refuges before vanishing completely. The day without dinosaurs was not a calendar date, but a fading, a drawn-out collapse written differently across continents. And so the stage was set for something new. The worst of the darkness would lift within a few years, though ecological scars lasted far longer. When the skies finally cleared and sunlight streamed back, Earth revealed a changed face. Forests reduced, diversity shattered, ecosystems simplified. Yet in this stripped-down world, the survivors had room to experiment. From the ruins of catastrophe, life was already beginning its next act. When the dust of catastrophe finally began to settle, the Earth that emerged looked strangely familiar and unfamiliar at once. From space, the continents were still largely where they had been in the late Cretaceous, but subtle shifts were already underway that would shape the future world. This was the Danian Age, the earliest stage of the Paleocene, spanning roughly 66 to 61.6 million years ago. It was a time defined less by motionless silence and more by a slow, cautious rebuilding. The geography of the planet was in transition. North America had already split from Europe, the widening Atlantic Ocean carving a path between them. South America remained an isolated continent, drifting further away from Africa. India, moving northward at breakneck geological speed, raced across the Tethys Ocean, not yet collided with Asia, but setting the stage for the Himalayas millions of years later. Antarctica, still joined to Australia, remained ice-free, a green continent swathed in temperate forests. Europe was a patchwork of islands and shallow seas, its fragmented landscapes home to unique communities. The coastlines bore the scars of impact. The Gulf of Mexico still held the fresh wound of Chicxulub, its basin a scarred seafloor gradually colonized by marine life. Around the world, other shorelines had been reworked by tsunamis and storms triggered by the asteroid strike. New estuaries and wetlands formed in their wake, fertile zones that would soon harbor recovering ecosystems. The climate of the Danian is often misunderstood. People imagine a world locked in endless cold after the impact, but the impact winter lasted only a few years. Once the dust and aerosols settled out of the stratosphere, Earth's climate bounced back, not to normal, but to a warmer-than-modern state. The Paleocene was a greenhouse world, lacking permanent ice caps. Average global temperatures stood several degrees higher than today, and the poles, while cool, supported forests rather than glaciers. Humidity was high across much of the planet. Rainfall returned quickly after the initial chaos, carrying nutrients into rivers and lakes. Floodplains became lush with new plant growth, and wetlands expanded in low-lying areas. These conditions favored the gradual return of forests, though they were less diverse than their Cretaceous predecessors. In many places, conifer groves dominated the landscape, broken by stretches of ferns, pioneer angiosperms, and sparse flowering shrubs. Despite the warmth, the climate was not uniform. Some regions remained unstable. Continental interiors experienced seasonal swings, with hot summers and cooler winters. The tropics, on the other hand, stayed persistently warm and damp, offering refuges for reptiles and amphibians. Regional climates reflected local geography more strongly than global averages, producing a patchwork world of recovering habitats. Volcanic activity also played a role. In India, the Deccan Traps, vast volcanic provinces that had already been active before the impact, continued to erupt intermittently into the early Paleocene. These outpourings of lava released additional greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, reinforcing the warming trend. Though not as immediately destructive as the asteroid, they provided a steady background pressure influencing climate and ocean chemistry for hundreds of thousands of years. In this greenhouse Earth, sea levels were relatively high. Shallow epicontinental seas spread across low-lying regions, creating vast coastal habitats rich in nutrients. Estuaries, mangrove-like forests, and tidal flats became cradles of life, supporting the early recovery of fishes, invertebrates, and reptiles. These productive margins were critical stepping stones for ecosystems struggling to regain balance. The Danian world, then, was one of contrasts. Its geography looked much like the Cretaceous, but the creatures that had defined that earlier age were gone. Its climate was warmer than our own, but its forests were simplified and eerily quiet. It was a world still recognizable in outline, yet transformed in spirit. A planet holding its breath as life cautiously stitched itself back together. This was the stage on which the survivors would adapt, diversify, and begin to shape the age of mammals. If you could walk across the continents in the earliest Paleocene, the quiet would be overwhelming. The mighty roars and heavy footsteps of dinosaurs were gone, but so too were the layered symphonies of late Cretaceous forests. Before the impact, woodlands had been complex networks of conifers, cycads, flowering trees, and ferns, tangled ecosystems filled with countless niches. In the Danian, those forests returned only in fragments, stripped down and simplified. In the immediate aftermath, bare ground stretched across huge swaths of land. Wildfires had cleared entire landscapes, leaving behind ashen soils rich in minerals but poor in life. Into these barren zones came the first wave of pioneers. Ferns, with their light spores capable of traveling long distances, were often the earliest to establish themselves. They spread across open ground in green carpets, transforming wastelands into temporary fern prairies. Their dominance was short-lived, but in that moment, they acted as ecological placeholders, holding soil in place and creating shade for more complex plants to follow. Conifers became the backbone of early Paleocene forests. Hardy lineages such as araucarias and relatives of pines and redwoods were well suited to the disturbed soils and changing climates. In many regions, they grew in relatively uniform stands, creating woodlands that lacked the layered diversity of their Cretaceous counterparts. These forests were quieter, simpler, and more monotonous, but they offered stability where chaos had once reigned. Gradually, angiosperms, flowering plants, began their comeback. Although heavily reduced during the extinction, they rebounded with remarkable persistence. Small shrubs and flowering trees crept back into the understory, their seeds carried by wind, water, and the surviving insects that pollinated them. Over tens of thousands of years, these plants diversified, reclaiming ground from the conifers. By the later Danian, early fruit-bearing trees were becoming more common, reshaping the forest into something more recognizable to us today. These forests were not lush in the way we imagine modern rainforests, but they carried the seeds of the future. Each new flowering plant opened doors for evolving insects and mammals. Fruits and nuts provided food for small generalists, while flowers attracted bees, flies, and beetles that had weathered the crisis. This resurgence of plant-insect partnerships marked a quiet turning point. The mutualistic dance between flowering plants and pollinators, disrupted by the impact, was beginning to find its rhythm again. Still, these Danian forests had a sameness to them. Across continents, the same hardy species dominated, producing what paleobotanists call homogeneous assemblages. Diversity, which had been so rich in the Cretaceous, was a long time returning. For now, landscapes lacked the dense variety of canopy, understory, and ground cover. Instead, large stretches of woodland looked remarkably alike, whether in North America, Europe, or Asia. If you had wandered these forests, what would you have seen? Tall conifers forming patchy canopies, with open ground below covered in ferns and low shrubs. Here and there, flowering trees with small fruits, attracting early mammals and birds. Fallen logs carpeted with fungi, feeding on the endless supply of decaying matter left over from the catastrophe. The air would have been quieter than before, with fewer insects buzzing and far fewer vertebrates moving among the trees. And yet, this relative stillness concealed immense potential. From these modest beginnings, forests would soon diversify into the complex systems we know today. Angiosperms would outcompete conifers, mammals would adapt to the opportunities provided by seeds and fruit, and birds would spread along the branches. What began as fern fields and uniform conifer stands was, in reality, the foundation of future rainforests, savannas, and woodlands. The first forests of the New Age were not the climax of recovery, but its opening act. They were nature's scaffolding, a framework upon which life could rebuild. Though simpler and quieter than the jungles of the dinosaurs, they were essential. For in their shadows, the survivors of the extinction, reptiles, mammals, insects, and birds, were preparing to reshape Earth in their own image. Although the non-avian dinosaurs had fallen, the story of reptiles did not end with them. In fact, the Danian world was still very much a reptilian planet. Crocodilians, turtles, lizards, and snakes all endured the catastrophe, and in the earliest Paleocene, many of them thrived. Where giant mammals were still years away from dominance, it was these ancient lineages that filled the gaps left behind by the dinosaurs. Crocodilians were among the most conspicuous survivors. Their physiology gave them an edge: low metabolic needs, flexible diets, and a reliance on aquatic habitats that buffered them from the worst of the impact winter. In North America, genera like Borealisuchus hunted in rivers and swamps, while in coastal waters of Africa and the Middle East, long-snouted dinosaurids flourished. These marine crocodiliforms grew large, feeding on fish and even young turtles, and in many estuaries they acted as apex predators long after mosasaurs had vanished. Alongside them were the choristoderes, an unusual group of long-snouted, semi-aquatic reptiles that had survived since the Jurassic. Champsosaurus, one of their best-known representatives, prowled freshwater rivers of North America and Europe. Resembling a crocodile in body plan, but unrelated, it was an ambush hunter, waiting in murky shallows for fish or amphibians to pass by. For a brief time, these reptiles were important predators in lakes and river systems stripped of dinosaurs. Turtles, however, may have been the greatest winners of all. Studies suggest that as many as 80% of turtle lineages survived the extinction, a staggering figure compared to the low survival of mammals. Their slow metabolisms, omnivorous diets, and protective shells allowed them to weather long periods of scarcity. In the Paleocene, turtles became abundant and diverse, from small freshwater species to larger marine forms gliding through coastal bays. They were so successful that they became staple prey for crocodilians, sharks, and even early mammals. Snakes also rose to prominence in this new world. Many were small constrictors, but the absence of large competitors allowed some lineages to expand in size. Fossils from the early Paleocene reveal boas and other snakes reaching lengths of several meters, giants compared to most of the surviving mammals of the time. They exploited niches from riverbanks to forest floors, their stealth and versatility securing them a firm place in the new ecosystems. Lizards, too, were quick to rebound. Iguanians spread widely, taking advantage of open woodlands, while monitors appeared in warmer regions, functioning as agile mid-sized predators. In some areas, they filled roles similar to those of small theropod dinosaurs, preying on insects, amphibians, and mammals that ventured into their territories. Taken together, reptiles ensured that the earliest Paleocene was not an age of mammals alone. Instead, it was a transitional period when ancient survivors still dictated the flow of ecosystems. Crocodiles ruled the waterways, turtles multiplied in staggering numbers, snakes lengthened and diversified, and lizards scuttled into every available niche. The age of mammals was indeed beginning, but it had to share the stage with these resilient holdovers from a vanished world. For more than 100 million years, mammals had lived in the shadows. During the reign of the dinosaurs, they were mostly small, nocturnal, and cautious, survivors that scurried between roots, burrowed underground, or hunted insects under cover of darkness. But with the great reptiles gone, those shadows lifted. The Paleocene did not immediately give rise to elephants or lions, but it did allow mammals to take their first real steps toward prominence. At the dawn of the Danian, most mammals were still small, mouse-sized insectivores, shrew-like omnivores, and rat-sized plant-eaters. Yet within a few 100,000 years, a remarkable change unfolded. Body sizes began to increase. By the Middle Paleocene, some species had reached the size of sheep or small pigs, a scale unseen in mammals since their origins. Freed from dinosaur competition, they were experimenting with size, diet, and behavior at a rapid pace. One of the most successful groups were the multituberculates, often described as the rodents of the Mesozoic. These long-lived mammals had complex teeth lined with multiple cusps, perfect for grinding seeds and vegetation. In the Paleocene, they diversified further, occupying roles similar to modern squirrels or beavers. They climbed trees, gnawed through tough plants, and became abundant across many continents, surviving in ecosystems where other mammalian lineages rose and fell. Placentals, however, were the real architects of the future. Early Paleocene forms included condylarths, archaic hoofed mammals that would eventually give rise to today's ungulates. They ranged from fox-sized omnivores to stockier herbivores, experimenting with diets and locomotion. Some had sturdy jaws and teeth adapted to crushing seeds or tough vegetation, while others leaned toward scavenging and opportunism. Their flexibility gave them an advantage in unpredictable environments. Marsupials, while less dominant globally, also survived the transition. In South America in particular, they retained a strong presence, diversifying into insectivorous and omnivorous niches. Their evolutionary experiments foreshadowed the extraordinary marsupial radiation that would later unfold in Australia after the continents drifted apart. What stands out about Paleocene mammals is not their grandeur, but their variety. In this period, evolution was running trials. Some lineages specialized as burrowers, some took to climbing, while others tested the potential of speed on open ground. Their skeletons show early hints of the diversity of movement we now associate with modern mammals: bounding, leaping, digging, and swimming. The groundwork for today's mammalian world was being laid, piece by piece. Still, compared to reptiles, mammals were modest players in size and strength. No Paleocene mammal matched the crocodiles in the rivers or the large snakes in the forests, but their advantage lay in numbers, adaptability, and rapid reproduction. Short lifespans and quick turnovers meant they could evolve faster, testing new forms at a pace reptiles could not match. The Danian was therefore not yet the true age of mammals, but it was the rehearsal. Small, unassuming, and often overlooked, these early survivors were quietly writing the blueprint for the future. In their paws, teeth, and bones lay the potential for primates, carnivores, ungulates, and eventually humans. In the quiet forests and open plains of the Paleocene, mammals were no longer shadows. They were the future taking its first breath. Predators defined the character of an ecosystem. In the Cretaceous, apex hunters were obvious. Tyrannosaurs, dromaeosaurs, and other great theropods commanded the food chain. But when they disappeared, nature faced a vacuum. Who would replace them? In the Danian, the answer was not straightforward. The first Paleocene predators were modest in scale, often clumsy in form, but they were pioneers, mammals and reptiles learning, through trial and error, how to take the throne of absent dinosaurs. Among the earliest contenders were the mesonychids, strange carnivorous mammals that looked nothing like wolves or cats. They were hoofed carnivores, their limbs ending in blunt, nail-like toes rather than sharp claws. Their jaws were massive, lined with teeth better suited to crushing and tearing than slicing. Small species such as Dissacus stalked riverbanks, hunting fish and small vertebrates. Larger relatives, appearing later in the Paleocene, pushed toward bear-like proportions, with ankylodon becoming one of the first truly formidable mammalian carnivores. They ran awkwardly, bounding in heavy strides, but their sheer power made up for a lack of speed. Rivaling them were the early creodonts, ancestors of the later hyenodonts and oxyanids. These mammals were smaller than mesonychids during the Danian, often no larger than foxes, but they carried the beginnings of a sharper toolkit. Their teeth were blade-like, specialized for shearing meat, and their skulls suggested keen senses of smell. Over time, they would eclipse mesonychids, but in the earliest Paleocene they were still gathering strength, lurking in the shadows of larger competitors. Not all predators were strictly mammalian. In lakes and estuaries, deerosaurid crocodilians ruled as aquatic hunters, snapping fish and ambushing unwary prey at shorelines. In northern rivers, choristidaries like Champsosaurus filled similar niches, blending reptilian persistence with amphibious stealth. These predators ensured that waterways remained dangerous, even if the tyrannosaurs were gone. On land, smaller carnivorous mammals filled the gaps between these giants and the insect eaters. Groups such as arctocyanids blurred the line between predator and omnivore. Some species scavenged carrion, others snapped up insects or fruit, and many were opportunistic hunters of small mammals. They may not have looked impressive, but they represent one of the key strategies of the time: flexibility. In an unstable world, rigid specialization was a death sentence, but adaptability could keep a lineage alive. Predation in the Danian was therefore scattered across multiple groups. There was no single king of the land, no dominant hunter towering over all others. Instead, ecosystems were mosaics of medium-sized carnivores, each experimenting with form and function. It was a transitional age, when predators were less elegant than their successors, but vital in restoring balance to food webs. The most important detail is that these new hunters proved mammals could rise beyond the role of scavengers or insectivores. By taking their first steps into apex positions, however awkwardly, they opened the door for later lineages to refine the art of predation. From these blunt-jawed, heavy-footed pioneers would eventually descend the sleek carnivorans of today: cats, dogs, bears, and hyenas. In the forests and plains of the Danian, predators were no longer dinosaurs, but they were unmistakably the foreshadowing of a new age of hunters. While the land was reshaping itself in the wake of the extinction, the skies told a quieter but equally dramatic story. For millions of years, the heavens had belonged not just to birds, but to the great pterosaurs, winged reptiles whose wingspans could stretch longer than a bus. At the end of the Cretaceous, pterosaurs disappeared entirely, leaving the air free of their sweeping silhouettes. Dinosaurs themselves were gone, but their avian descendants, true birds, endured. The skies of the Paleocene, however, were far less crowded than before. Most bird lineages did not survive the catastrophe. The enantiornithines, a diverse group of toothed, clawed birds that had dominated the late Cretaceous, were wiped out completely. Only the crown group of modern birds, the neornithines, passed through the bottleneck. This meant that the birds of the Danian were not a continuation of the old order, but the fragile beginnings of the modern avian world. Early Paleocene bird fossils reveal modest forms. There were primitive relatives of ducks, geese, and shorebirds that patrolled wetlands and coasts. Small ground dwellers scratched among the roots of forests, while divers adapted to lakes and rivers. Most were not large or flamboyant. Survival had favored small generalist feeders that could exploit seeds, insects, and aquatic plants. They filled niches left empty by the extinction, but on a humbler scale than the mighty creatures that had once shared their skies. With insect populations still recovering, many birds turned to omnivory, mixing diets of seeds, shoots, and carrion. Others, like early shorebirds, probed mudflats for invertebrates. In forests, the return of flowering plants gradually supported frugivorous birds that spread seeds across recovering landscapes. These roles, though small, were vital in reestablishing the cycles of growth and renewal. Interestingly, flightlessness did not yet define the Paleocene as it would later in the Cenozoic. Giant ground birds, such as the terror birds of South America, would only appear millions of years later. In the Danian, most birds were relatively small and capable of flight. Mobility was an advantage in unstable ecosystems where habitats could shift suddenly. Their anatomy shows the beginnings of the diversity we recognize today. Some lineages experimented with diving adaptations, elongating their legs and modifying wings for underwater pursuit. Others leaned toward seed-cracking beaks or probing bills, tools shaped by the rise of new food sources. Evolution was moving quickly, but cautiously, sketching the outlines of modern avian orders without yet filling in their dramatic forms. The absence of pterosaurs also meant that birds inherited the role of aerial insectivores and scavengers. While still small, they became the sole rulers of the skies, and their dominance would only expand with time. The Paleocene was thus the foundation of modern bird life, a pared-down avian world, fragile but resilient, carrying forward the dinosaur legacy in feathered form. From humble beginnings in a recovering world, these survivors would radiate into the astonishing diversity of birds we know today. The skies of the Danyan were quieter, yes, but they belonged, fully and permanently, to the birds. The extinction that toppled the dinosaurs also tore apart the delicate partnership between plants and insects. Before the impact, late Cretaceous forests had buzzed with life. Bees pollinating flowers, beetles chewing through leaves, butterflies hovering over blossoms. Afterward, silence fell. With sunlight blocked and vegetation scarce, many insect groups crashed alongside their plant partners. Fossil leaves from the earliest Paleocene often show little to no insect damage, a striking absence compared to the complex feeding traces etched into Cretaceous foliage. Yet insects are nothing if not survivors. Those that lived through the crisis did so by feeding on detritus, or exploiting whatever scraps remained. Beetles, ants, and termites, already masters of decomposition, found a temporary feast in the endless supply of dead wood and rotting vegetation. They became the invisible recyclers of the ruined world, breaking down organic matter and returning nutrients to the soil. This was a hidden engine of recovery. Without them, plants would have struggled to recolonize devastated landscapes. As forests slowly returned, insects followed. Fern-dominated landscapes saw the rise of spore-feeding specialists, while conifer groves provided resin and wood for beetles and wasps. But the true turning point came with the resurgence of flowering plants. With each new blossom, pollinators found a foothold. Bees, though reduced in diversity, rebounded as flowering shrubs spread through the Paleocene understory. Flies and beetles adapted as generalist pollinators, shuttling pollen between early blooms. Lepidopterans, the ancestors of modern butterflies and moths, re-established fragile links with angiosperms, helping to stitch ecosystems back together. Leaf fossils from the Danyan provide a record of this return. At first, feeding traces are simple, occasional nibbles or holes. Over time, more complex damage reappears. Mines carved through leaves by insect larvae, intricate galls created by wasps, and the telltale shredding of caterpillars. Each pattern marks the gradual rebuilding of ecological networks, as insects diversified into roles of herbivores, pollinators, and decomposers once again. The relationship between insects and plants was not just ecological but evolutionary. Insects pressured plants to evolve defenses, tougher leaves, chemical deterrents, while plants offered nectar, pollen, and fruit as incentives. This arms race and partnership, interrupted by the extinction, resumed in the Paleocene with fresh momentum. Within a few million years, flowering plants and their insect partners had recovered enough to set the stage for the lush, complex forests of the Eocene. For animals higher on the food chain, the revival of insects meant opportunity. Early birds and mammals relied on them as a primary food source. Insect-rich habitats supported small omnivores and created new pathways for energy to flow through ecosystems. Simply put, the return of pollination and herbivory signaled the return of functioning food webs. The insect world of the Danyan was not yet as dazzling as what came later, but it was essential. By buzzing between flowers, chewing through leaves, and tunneling into wood, these small survivors reawakened the heartbeat of the land. Without them, the forests of the New Age could not have risen. On land, the fall of the dinosaurs was dramatic, but in the seas, the extinction was equally profound. For millions of years, the oceans had been ruled by immense reptiles. Mosasaurs patrolling the open waters, plesiosaurs gliding through coastal shallows, and giant turtles navigating vast seaways. At the end of the Cretaceous, these marine titans vanished, leaving behind a void as deep as the waters themselves. The Danyan seas were quieter, but they were also fertile ground for new rulers to rise. The first to seize the opportunity were the sharks. Of the nearly 30 shark families that swam during the late Cretaceous, the vast majority survived. In the absence of marine reptiles, their populations expanded rapidly. Lamniform sharks, relatives of modern great whites, diversified, some growing to formidable lengths. Fossils of Oddities obliquus, appearing within a million years of the extinction, reveal sharks that could reach up to 9 meters, rivaling later great predators of the seas. They became the undisputed hunters of fish, turtles, and smaller sharks. Alongside them, rays and skates flourished. Flattened bodies and crushing teeth allowed them to exploit shellfish beds that proliferated in shallow waters. With competitors gone, these cartilaginous fishes radiated into new ecological roles, cementing their place as essential components of Paleocene seas. The teleost fishes, already diversifying in the Cretaceous, surged forward during the Danian. Groups of spiny-rayed fishes, eels, and deep-bodied species began to fill niches once occupied by marine reptiles. They became the new foundation of food webs, supporting not only sharks and rays, but also seabirds and marine turtles. The expansion of teleosts marked a permanent shift, from reptile-dominated seas to fish-driven ecosystems. Marine turtles were another group that thrived. Their resilience during the extinction allowed them to remain widespread and ecologically important. Some species grazed on seagrasses in shallow bays, while others traveled long distances across open oceans. They not only endured but became keystone prey for sharks, further anchoring the new order of marine life. Even stranger survivors persisted. Chimeras, cartilaginous fish distantly related to sharks, prowled continental shelves, their broad tooth plates ideal for crushing mollusks. Though rarely as abundant as sharks or bony fishes, they were reminders of ancient lineages still hanging on in changing seas. Perhaps most striking, however, was what was missing. The ammonites, those coiled-shelled cephalopods that had filled oceans for hundreds of millions of years, were gone. Once numbering in countless species, they disappeared almost completely at the KPG boundary. Their absence was felt keenly. Predators that once specialized in ammonites had to adapt, and new niches opened for squids and octopuses, which began their own rise in prominence. The Danian oceans then were not barren but reorganized. Gone were the reptilian leviathans, replaced by agile hunters of cartilage and bone. Sharks patrolled the depths, rays combed the seafloors, and teleost fishes swam in dazzling variety. It was a new chapter, one where speed, flexibility, and numbers triumphed over the size and dominance of the past. In these seas, the future was already visible. The ocean giants of later epochs, from massive sharks to whales, would trace their origins back to this reshaped world. The extinction had silenced the mosasaurs, but it had also cleared the stage for an entirely different cast of rulers to command the waves. The story of the early Paleocene was not uniform. Recovery unfolded differently across continents, shaped by geography, climate, and local survivors. By examining these regional snapshots, we glimpse the patchwork character of the Danian world, a planet rebuilding itself in countless unique ways. North America was one of the best-studied theaters of recovery. In what is now the western United States, the great inland seas of the Cretaceous had retreated, leaving behind broad river valleys and floodplains. Forests of conifers and early flowering plants fringed slow-moving rivers, where turtles basked on logs and crocodiles hunted in the shallows. Champsosaurus, the Choristodere, haunted lakes, its long jaws snapping fish beneath the water's surface. On land, multituberculates and small placental mammals scurried under the trees, while early mesonychids patrolled the river margins. Fossil beds from this region show that although diversity was low, ecosystems were functioning within a few 100,000 years. Across the Tethys Seaway, which stretched from North Africa through the Middle East, recovery looked different. Here, dirosaurid crocodilians dominated estuaries, prowling brackish waters where sharks and rays also flourished. The warm, shallow seas were nurseries for teleost fishes and early marine turtles. Along the coasts, conifer stands mingled with pioneering angiosperms, creating transitional landscapes of woodland and wetland. This region's rich fossil record demonstrates how quickly marine predators re-established dominance, even in the absence of mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. Europe, by contrast, was fragmented into a mosaic of islands and peninsulas. This geographic isolation produced ecosystems that were both limited and peculiar. Fossils from Denmark and France reveal forests dominated by conifers, where lizards were especially abundant. Mammals remained small and generalized, surviving in scattered pockets across island habitats. Avian fossils suggest early waterfowl-like birds, patrolled estuaries. While inland, the skies were quieter. Europe's insular nature may have slowed recovery compared to larger land masses, but it preserved unique evolutionary experiments. In the southern hemisphere, conditions varied widely. In South America, marsupials maintained a stronger foothold than in the north, diversifying into insectivores and small omnivores. Forests returned under warm, humid conditions, supporting iguanas, snakes, and turtles. Offshore, seabird-like forms hunted fish, precursors to the penguins and cormorants that would later dominate southern oceans. Meanwhile, in Antarctica, still ice-free at this time, temperate forests stretched across the continent. Fossil pollen reveals a mix of conifers and angiosperms thriving in polar daylight seasons, providing habitats for reptiles and birds even at high latitudes. Each of these regions tells part of the same story: resilience shaped by local conditions. Where freshwater systems were abundant, crocodilians and turtles prospered. Where coastlines stretched wide, sharks and marine reptiles recovered swiftly. Where climates were humid and stable, plants rebounded faster, pulling insects and mammals along with them. The global narrative of the Danian was not of uniform devastation and recovery, but of countless small worlds, each reinventing itself in the aftermath of catastrophe. The Earth of the early Paleocene was therefore a patchwork planet. From North American rivers to African coasts, from European islands to Antarctic forests, ecosystems stitched themselves together in different ways, but toward the same end: the renewal of life. The great extinction of 66 million years ago is often remembered for what was lost: the dinosaurs, the ammonites, the pterosaurs. But just as fascinating is what remained. Crocodiles endured, turtles multiplied, birds carried on, and mammals seized their chance. Why them and not the others? Survival was not random. It was shaped by biology, ecology, and a bit of luck. One of the most important factors was metabolism. Large-bodied dinosaurs required enormous amounts of food each day, and when plant life collapsed, they had no buffer. By contrast, crocodiles, turtles, and many mammals had relatively low energy requirements. A crocodile could survive for weeks on a single large meal, while a small mammal could hide in a burrow and feed on insects or seeds. Energy thrift was a decisive advantage in a starving world. Another factor was dietary flexibility. Specialists tend to suffer in times of crisis, while generalists endure. Animals able to eat plants, insects, carrion, or whatever else they encountered had better odds. Turtles grazed on algae, scavenged carcasses, and nibbled plants. Early mammals switched between insects, seeds, and roots. Even snakes, though carnivorous, could tackle a wide range of small prey, from amphibians to mammals, depending on what was available. Diversity of diet meant resilience. Habitat also mattered. Freshwater systems like rivers, lakes, and wetlands provided a measure of stability. Aquatic environments buffered extreme temperature shifts and preserved food webs based on detritus rather than photosynthesis. That is why so many freshwater animals, crocodiles, turtles, amphibians, and even some fishes, fared better than purely terrestrial specialists. Reproductive strategy gave survivors an additional edge. Mammals with short lifespans and rapid breeding cycles could rebound quickly, testing new evolutionary pathways in just a few generations. Dinosaurs, with their slower growth and longer reproductive cycles, could not adapt at the same pace. Birds, too, benefited from fast reproduction, allowing them to rebuild populations from small, scattered survivors. Geographic spread increased chances of survival. Species restricted to one region were vulnerable if that habitat collapsed, but those with wide ranges had more refugees. For example, crocodilians were found across many continents, giving them multiple strongholds during the crisis. Similarly, plant lineages with wide dispersal methods, such as ferns with airborne spores, were among the first to recolonize devastated areas. Finally, there was sheer luck of circumstance. The asteroid's devastation was global, but its effects varied in intensity. Some pockets of Earth may have been less affected, serving as refuges where populations endured. Random survival at local scales often determined which lineages had the chance to recover, and which vanished forever. Taken together, these traits, low energy demands, flexible diets, refuge in aquatic or sheltered habitats, rapid reproduction, and wide distribution, explain why some groups thrived while others collapsed. Survival was not a matter of strength, but of adaptability. The legacy of these survivors cannot be overstated. Because they endured, they carried the genetic blueprints that would shape all later ecosystems. From unassuming rodents to small shorebirds to tough-shelled turtles, the creatures that clung to life in the Dannean were the architects of the world that followed. When people imagine the world after the dinosaurs, a common picture comes to mind. A planet instantly emptied of giants, where mammals immediately took over, and ecosystems quickly began to resemble those of today. The truth is far more complicated. The earliest Paleocene was not a neat succession, but a messy, uneven recovery full of surprises. To understand it, we need to clear up some common misconceptions. The first misconception is that all dinosaurs vanished overnight. While the non-avian dinosaurs were indeed gone within a short geological span, their closest relatives, birds, are dinosaurs too. Every sparrow, pigeon, and crow you see today is a living branch of the dinosaur family tree. The extinction did not erase dinosaurs, it transformed them. The age of dinosaurs became the age of birds. A second misconception is that mammals immediately exploded into large, dominant forms. Popular images often show Paleocene landscapes filled with creatures resembling modern lions or elephants. In reality, the first mammals to expand were modest in size: fox-like masonichids, rodent-sized multituberculates, and shrew-like insectivores. It would take millions of years, not thousands, before truly large mammals appeared. The Paleocene was a time of experimentation, not instant dominance. Another common idea is that the world became barren and lifeless after the asteroid. While devastation was real, Earth was never empty. Life clung on in refuges, freshwater lakes, coastal marshes, and underground burrows. Ferns rapidly spread across open ground, insects recycled dead matter, and crocodiles hunted in rivers. The landscape was damaged but never dead. Recovery was slower than often imagined, but it began almost immediately. It is also easy to believe that the extinction was purely destructive, erasing life indiscriminately. In truth, it was selective. Animals with high energy needs, specialized diets, or limited ranges were hardest hit. Survivors often shared traits of adaptability, small size, and ecological flexibility. This distinction matters because it shows that evolution is not just chance. It is filtered by survival strategies. A final misconception is that the Paleocene world looked familiar. If we stepped into the Dannean forests, they would not resemble modern jungles. Diversity was low, with uniform stands of conifers and scattered flowering shrubs. Insects were sparse, mammals were small, and birds were limited in kind. The landscapes would feel eerily quiet compared to today. Only later, in the Eocene, would ecosystems regain the richness we now take for granted. Clearing up these misunderstandings changes how we see the story. The extinction was not a sudden switch from dinosaurs to mammals, nor a complete collapse of life, nor an instant recovery. It was a drawn-out process marked by survival, adaptation, and gradual rebuilding. By recognizing this, we can appreciate the resilience of life, how ecosystems reorganize themselves after catastrophe, and how the seeds of our modern world were planted in those humble, chaotic beginnings. The Danian epoch was not an interlude between two great ages, but a bridge, a passage from the reign of reptiles to the rise of mammals. It was a world scarred by catastrophe, yet alive with possibility. In those quiet forests, murky rivers and recovering seas, the survivors of the great extinction began writing the rules of a new era, the age of mammals. The story of this time is not one of emptiness, but of resilience. Crocodiles, turtles, and snakes endured with ancient strength. Birds, the last living dinosaurs, adapted and spread, turning silence into song. Insects revived the delicate dance of pollination, restoring the bond between plants and animals. And mammals, small and unassuming, began their climb toward dominance, exploring forms and roles that would later give us elephants, whales, and even primates. From chaos, new ecosystems emerged. Food webs grew layer by layer, forests regained color, and oceans filled with motion again. Every step forward was a reminder that life, though fragile, is unyielding in its persistence. Extinction had swept away giants, but it had also cleared the stage for fresh experiments. The end of dinosaurs was not the end of life's story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that leads directly to us. When we look back on the Danian, we see not just a lost world, but our own origins. Without the resilience of those survivors, without the slow rebuilding of ecosystems, the mammalian story would never have unfolded. The world we inhabit, rich, diverse, and vibrant, was born from the ashes of that ancient catastrophe. And so, the dawn of the age of mammals is also the dawn of our story. The extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs created the conditions for human existence. Their ending was our beginning. If you've enjoyed this journey through deep time, exploring how life clawed its way back from the brink, consider subscribing. There are countless more stories hidden in Earth's past, stories of resilience, mystery, and transformation, waiting to be told. Stay with us, and together, we'll keep uncovering the wonders of the ancient world.